Are you interested in learning about writing middle grade books or historical fiction? Then this is the show for you. Hello, my name's Tonya Duncan Ellis, and I'm the author of the Sophie Washington book series. And this is another episode of Write This, my author interview show. And today I will be pleased to welcome on Barbara Belford, who is an award-winning middle grade author who has written a historical fiction book. So she'll be on to talk about that and her author journey. So I'm excited to see that. I see a friend of mine here, Judy Allen Dotson. Hey, Judy, how you doing? She asked to be in the video, but I have the author on, Barbara Belford. So I'll contact you, Judy. I'm so happy to see you here, and she's been on the show as well in the past. So I'll have to check with her. Okay. Hello. Let's see what's going on here. I got a request from her. Judy.
Why are you I'm not supposed to be on.
Okay, well, you get off of here.
Okay.
I just saw a request from you, and I'm going to get Barbara on because she's on. I'll see you later.
Okay, bye.
All right. Good to see you. Okay, so now we will have, let's get her. Barbara Belford's going to come on here. And I didn't know if Judy had something to tell me, if she knew Barbara or what. So Barbara, I know that you're here, and we're going to have you. And there's never a dull moment on Write This. Always something coming on. Hey, Barbara, how are you doing?
Hey, I'm good. How are you?
Did you see that I had Judy Allen Dodson on?
I know, like, shoot, I'd rather see her.
It's always something. It's never a dull moment on Write This. But I'm so happy to have you on and learn about your books. And I was looking a little bit at your books. I haven't read the book that I had been seeing on there that was a historical fiction, but it looks like a fascinating story.
It was a very interesting book to write, let me tell you.
Yeah, it looks so cool. I really didn't know a lot about that. The book talks about a Chicago race riot in 1919. I had not heard much about that.
You and me both. And I grew up here.
Right.
So, you know, it was to me quite a shocking revelation when I discovered the information about it as I was biking on the bike trail. So I was like,
okay.
Wow.
Well, can you tell us a little? Well, first, let's get a little bit of background of information about you. So you're based in Chicago. Can you tell us a little bit about your background, and then we'll learn about how you uncovered something on the bike trail that led you to write that fascinating book.
Yeah.
So give us a little bit about your backstory.
Well, I grew up, you know, in the era where there wasn't TV. We didn't have a TV till I was 12. And so I had a lot of time for reading and writing in my life. I had a sixth grade teacher who really inspired us to write. She had a contest every 2 weeks, and we could submit our stories, and then she would choose the best and read them out loud. And I even had a little critique group of my own. We would meet. I remember sitting next to my bed on the floor and like reading each other our stories. So I grew up wanting to be a writer. But then fast forward to college, I took some creative writing courses. I took a journalism course because I thought, you know, I couldn't just write and not make money. I would have to do something that could make money. And I did not care for confronting people and having to write stories that had like multiple perspectives and conflict in them. And so I was like, no. So, you know, back in the day, really, there were outliers that did other jobs, but mostly for us women, it was being a nurse, being a teacher, or being a secretary. And so I chose to be a teacher. And I went ahead and got my degree in California, which was 5 years. So I had to have a major, which I have an English major. And then I got my ESL certification, and I taught in schools in Aurora. So I moved back to Chicagoland area, and I taught for 35 years in a school in Aurora, Illinois. It's an under-resourced community. We had 80% Hispanic Latino kids, and I raised my children, 4 children. I really didn't do much writing except for school-related writing. So I wrote some readers' theaters. during Black History Month, and I would always write little books for the kids who were struggling to read. So I was a second grade teacher, third grade teacher, and then a reading teacher, and then I was a literacy coach.
Mm-hmm.
And I loved every minute of that. Just, enjoyed that so much. And as soon as my kids all moved out and went away to college, I had the empty nest,
right.
and I had time to start to write. And I wrote a young adult novel and got accepted into a master program at the University of Wisconsin, where the teacher there helped us with our work, made sure it was good, and, gave us pointers. And so then I pitched that at a Writers Institute, and none of the agents or editors wanted it.
Right.
But one of the editors said to me, "Do you have anything else?"
Mm-hmm. And
I was like, kind of off the cuff, said, "Well, I'm working on a book about a boy who loves to play soccer who's from Mexico." Mm-hmm. And she said, "Oh, that interests me. Send me that." Well, it wasn't done. So I had to hurry and finish that. And the reason I was writing that book was I had a favorite student. I know, teachers say they don't really have favorite students, but we do. And he was one of my favorites, Ramon. And I had him in kindergarten all the way through third grade as a pull-out reading program, because he had struggles in reading. But in third grade, he exited from my program. And so I saw him in fourth grade in the hall, and I was so excited to see him back at school. And I said, "What are you reading?" And he said, "Oh, I don't like to read. I don't read anything." Mm-hmm. And I was just, can't happen. I said, "Well, why don't you like to read?" And he said, "Well, I can't find anything that I want to read." Mm-hmm. So when I asked him what he wanted to read, he said he wanted to read about boys who played soccer from Mexico.
Oh, that's
and so
cool.
I had said to him, "Well, if I write you a book, will you read it?" So the end of that story is that editor ended up picking me up as an author, and I finished the book, and I read the chapters. His fifth grade teacher, read the chapters to the class as they came back from the edit staff mm-hmm. at Skyhorse. And then I went in for the reveal in the end to tell them who wrote the book.
Oh, that is so sweet. That's a very nice.
Yeah, and I gave Ramon a copy. I don't know for sure he read it. He said he did. But anyway.
Okay, well, that's very interesting. And that's the dream for many people when they retire or they want to switch careers. So you were able to really realize that and make that happen.
Yeah, and I wrote the book. I got the book published in the last 2 years before I retired. And then I decided, like now that I'm going to be an author, you don't know the business when you first become an author. And I was like, oh, now I'm going to have all these books to write. So let's downsize and move from the suburbs to the city. Mm-hmm. So we actually live in Chicago Loop, right downtown. Oh. And that's how I happened to be on the bike trail.
And so what did you see on the bike trail? What happened?
I was riding my bike on, the Lakefront Trail is a beautiful trail in Chicago. And there's a rock with a plaque on it that I'd never seen before, because I wasn't that used to coming to Chicago. And so I got off my bike and I went to read the plaque, and it said that this marked the spot where Eugene Williams had lost his life by a rock that was thrown at the boys he was with on a raft because they had crossed the invisible color line. Mm-hmm. And I couldn't believe it because, first of all, I lived here my whole life. I lived near Chicago, mm-hmm. 30 miles away. And I had not ever heard that story ever in my life. In fact, when I then started researching, I had never heard that there were race riots in Chicago. Right. I just, my history that I learned was very whitewashed. And I was shocked that I had missed so much of what really had happened. So then I started doing, just more research and finding out about, I looked up his death certificate. And, he was 16 years old, and these boys were on a raft, and they would put it in by the brewery in Chicago because the water that would come into the lake, if you're not familiar with Lake Michigan, is like ice. So they would go into this spot. They called it the hot and cold. And the water coming into the lake was hot from this brewery. Mm. And so it kind of mixed with the cold water. And so they would put this little raft in there. And Lake Michigan can be very choppy and, currents, lots of currents, and they accidentally floated towards this beach, which was only white people were allowed on this beach.
Mm-hmm.
And as they were in this area trying to get away from the area, a man got angry and threw rocks, and none of the boys could swim.
Mm-hmm.
And Eugene was knocked off the raft, and the rest of the boys on the raft, tried to rescue him, but they couldn't get to him because the raft kept moving. So they rushed back to the beach where the black people were allowed to go, and they got a black policeman to come with them back to the white beach. And the white policeman refused to do anything about the situation. Mm-hmm. And instead, he arrested one of the men who was trying to argue to help the boys. Mm-hmm. So it was just, for me, finding all this out, it just became this huge rabbit hole where mm-hmm. it was going down and down and down. I found out about, the unions, the Great Migration, how the men had come back from the war expecting their jobs that had been given away to the men who had come here because they needed people to work here. And so they had enticed families to come from the South. And now these men who expected their jobs to be here, were angry that these men had crossed the picket lines, the union lines, to take their jobs. It was just a hotbed of things that were happening in 1919 here. Oh. So,
that's interesting.
It was really interesting.
Yeah, very interesting. And I hadn't heard of that incident. I've heard of those kind of things with the jobs and things like that. So that was really neat. And then, so where did you get the information? Was it through the internet, libraries? Like if people are interested in doing historical research for fiction?
Yeah. Well, that was my first, I think if you're going to, write a historical fiction book, you have to have like a catalyst moment. And for me, that was finding out about Eugene and feeling like at that point, no one had told his story. And it wasn't until later, there's another book that's out called A Few Red Drops. It's by Claire Hartfield. And that talks a lot about what happened during that summer, but there really wasn't anything out there for children about that. So I felt like I wanted to tell not from, the Eugene side, but I wanted to tell from Billy's side how he had to confront his white privilege and understand what was happening in Chicago during that time. Right. So I would say the first thing is that catalyst, and then start to do your research about, just looking at the characters you have, finding documents. I just couldn't believe there's so many things that are still out there and available. Mm-hmm. Chicago History Museum was a great resource for me. And looking at photos of 1919, just looking at photos of people who had come here in the Great Migration and envisioning, how their lives, advertisements that I found offering people a basket of chicken and a free train ticket to come here to Chicago. It was crazy what things I found. And then the neighborhoods. And I realized, and a really important thing too is if you're doing historical fiction, I would say find a map of the area that you're planning to write about from that decade that you're writing. So I found a Chicago map, a historical map from 1915, I think it was. And then I plotted all the events on that map. Mm-hmm. And after I finished plotting, the beach where Eugene died, where his address was, where he grew up, the White Sox park, because that would have been a huge thing for kids back in those days. And I plotted, in the grocery store where he used to work. And I realized that where I live is like less than a mile from all these events that had happened.
Right.
And, so that was a big thing for me too. So I was able to go to the stockyards, and go to the beach where it happened, find where his home would have been,
right,
and retrace the steps. So some of the parts of the book I actually wrote on site, like the picture on the front, that's a bridge that's in Chicago. I wrote the chapter where the boys are on the bridge.
Now, do you have a copy of the book there that you can show?
I do.
Okay, yeah, sure.
I don't actually have a copy because I'm not like in my house, and I was like, oh shoot, I should have brought that, but
okay, yeah. So show
you can see the boys are on the bridge.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So that's cool. So that's a good idea to get the feel for the scene by actually visiting those.
Yeah, and this is the plaque. I don't know if you can see that, but that's the plaque that's on that rock.
Oh,
And it has a quote from my favorite quote from Dr. Martin Luther King is on that rock too. So yeah, so those are things I would recommend to just really get yourself immersed in that area where you're writing about and the characters' lives that you're writing about. Those things really help me. And the other thing that was amazing is, you know, they have newspapers in public libraries now that are just databases on, you know, online that you can just do from your home.
mm-hmm. Oh, okay.
And so I read a lot of, you know, the Defender was a Chicago-based magazine that was written during that time. And I read the Tribune, you know, I read all these different newspapers. Another thing that's really important is to look at the advertisements, because that gives you a sense of like how much things cost. And, you know, like the vacuum cleaner, for example, I was going to have in the book, there's a vacuum cleaner that gets broken. And so I was putting a vacuum cleaner in it, and my editor noticed, and she's like, Billy's family wouldn't have been able to afford a vacuum. Find out how much they cost, you know. You had to look that up. So.
Oh, that's very interesting. Now, here's a question that occurred to me as you were speaking. So when you saw the news reports of what happened, how did they show it? Did they paint it as it was a bad thing, or how did they show this in the news?
Yeah, it's really interesting. That's a really interesting question, because, and that's one of the things I talk about when I go talk to students. I show them the newspaper article. First of all, the article wasn't published until like 3 weeks after the event happened. Mm-hmm. And even then, when it's published, it uses a lot of like loaded words, you know, not a straightforward news story. Mm-hmm. It sounds like the boys were doing something wrong. Mm-hmm. And that, you know, so it's not what we would consider fair journalism today. Right. And so it's interesting because kids can pick those words out, you know, like, oh, they use that word, you know, those aren't words we use today. Mm-hmm. So the better story was in the, I would say the Defender. I think the Defender had one, or a Chicago newspaper that was Black owned, that had a fair story about it. But, you know, you're bringing in all those resources, and then you're sifting through to decide, you know, how to tell the story. Yeah,
because you're kind of like a detective. It's like a detective.
You know, exactly. Yeah. When you have to decide what's true, too, because there were so many different stories of how that happened on the boat. But the one that I took to be the most factual was an eyewitness account from one of the boys. John, his name was. Mm-hmm. And he later recounted that in a book that was written. And so I felt like his story, you know, was the best that I could trust. Mm-hmm. So yeah, it is like being a detective, and it's fun, but then you find so much information sometimes that you have to figure out what to put in the book.
Now, how did you do that, and how long did it take you to write this book?
It took me a year to write the book, and then it took a year for the publisher to get it published. And I was really worried that it wasn't going to be published, because it was published in 2017. Mm-hmm. And you know that there were a lot of loaded events that happened in those years, with a lot of unrest, I would say,
especially
that was happening.
Yeah. Huh? Especially in Chicago, because that's when they were calling it
Chicago. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. And I actually got so worried that they were just going to not publish it that I wrote a letter to Jodi Picoult, because I had just read Small Great Things and I loved it so much. And I said to her, you know, I feel like we need more books that expose things like this, and the racial tension that nobody talks about, that we didn't know about, you know. And I didn't think I'd get a letter back or anything, but she sent me back a letter, and she's just like, hold on, you know, it'll happen. You just be patient, you know. And sure enough, they did go ahead with it. They just had some restructuring in the company, and like all their children's editors at Skyhorse were let go. And so then my project was taken over by someone else. So it was just one of those, you know, to wait. But anyway, yeah, so it was hard. And it was hard to know. I knew I could not write that, you know, it wasn't my lived experience to know how it felt to be, you know, an immigrant, to come to Chicago, or to, have racial prejudice against me. I knew I couldn't write that from my perspective, but my grandparents came from Ireland, and Bridgeport is right next to where this large Black community was forced to live. And so I thought, well, I could write that from a boy who had the same interests, as Eugene's family, the White Sox, going to the lake, but I could write it from his perspective and tell a story of how a boy who, he didn't think he was prejudiced. He didn't think he was racist. But after he experienced some of the things that he saw, Foster, which is Eugene's fake brother, go through, he started to understand what it was like. So that's how I feel like.
Well, that seems like a good way to get dialogue going and get people learning about different things and understanding each other. So that's good.
Yeah. I mean, and I feel like too, it was very difficult for me to know whether it was okay for me to write this story, because there is that fine line of, do you write a story that tells someone else's perspective along with your own, or do you let that other culture write that story? But I had a lot of authenticity readers read it, and they did not give me that idea. They didn't say, oh, this isn't yours to write. They were very appreciative of a person looking at it from those eyes of how this could help people that, are white, looking at themselves and thinking, oh, we're not like this, but, we are. It's a colonialist, agenda that's constant that you have to fight against. So it was probably the hardest book I've written, but also the most fulfilling. So
yeah, that sounds cool. So are your other books historical fiction, or is this the main one that was historical?
The other two books are more contemporary stories, but they also deal with the idea of social justice. So the first book, Canned and Crushed, the father is undocumented and can't go back to Mexico, and they don't have insurance. When his sister gets sick, they can't go back to they can't get insurance to help her fix her heart. So the mother has to take the daughter back to Mexico where she can afford the surgery. And so the little guy in the story that plays soccer is left with his dad to kind of cope with everything that's happening in life. And he decides he's going to earn money by having a recycling program at school. And he gets all this cans and, it's through the whole story. And then he finds out that the school gets the money and he doesn't get it. And, so that's that story that, is more, more just looking at how difficult it is for people who are undocumented or even immigrants to our country to have fair treatment. And then the third book I wrote, it's called Another D for Dee Dee. And that book I wrote, it's called a companion novel because one of the characters from Canned and Crushed is in that book. I wrote that one because every time I would go back to school and how it is, because you're an author, when you go somewhere, you feel like you're a celebrity in some little venues, when I go back to my old school, I'm a celebrity. It's the only place where people will kids will come out in the hallway and they'll talk about me, And there was this girl, I would come back to classrooms and visit, and there was this girl named Daisy who just hounded me. She was like a super fan. And he was just always like, when are you going to write a girl book? When are you going to write a girl book? When are you going to write a girl book? And I was like, you know what? Everybody reads these books. And finally, one day I thought, I should at least talk to her. So I made a little time to talk to her. And I was like, why do you keep asking me that? She's like, well, I have diabetes. I've never read a book about a girl with diabetes before. And I thought, well, that is a valid point. So I started doing research about diabetes in the Latin American community, and it's very high. I mean, there's a very high incidence of that. And so I started doing, I went on Fridays to visit her and went with her to the lunchroom and watched how difficult it was to find, the meal that was supposed to be there. You're supposed to have chicken, but they didn't have it. So instead they had waffles,
Right.
And she gave me waffles. I talked to her mom, how difficult it is if you're a native speaker and you can't read English labels to know what the ingredients are in foods for your daughter who's diabetic. So that was another interesting book to write as well.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of learning curves for me in that book.
But really, even though you're writing about different groups, these are your own lived experiences as well, because you taught in those school systems for 30 years with the kids.
Yeah, 35 years.
35 years. So
yeah.
you are
yeah.
immersed in the community and part of that community as well. So you have that authenticity because of your own experience working with the kids.
Yeah. And it's fun to go. I mean, when I do author visits now, like I just did another author visit. I do an author visit for a school in Elgin. It's a dual language classroom. The teacher has me come every year. And it's just really fun to see how they identify with the things in the book,
Mm-hmm.
even though, it's not like I have never lived in Mexico, but they, with research, when you do research and like you said, working with these, a population for 35 years, you do know what things that they like and what they want to read about and that kind of thing. So
yeah, that's good. And it's like that's in your heart. You love these kids and it's in your heart to help them and get their stories told, because especially if a lot of them weren't even native English speakers, their parents, they didn't have that voice.
Well, and I'm so glad that now, I mean, it was 2015 when Canned & Crushed was written. And the change since 2015 is phenomenal. There are so many more, BIPOC people publishing and being allowed to speak and tell the stories that they know and that they do have, authentic lives that live these stories. So there just wasn't as many back in 2015. So, I mean, it doesn't seem like a long period of time. This is only 2022, but, things have changed, and I hope they keep changing. I feel like we're on a good trajectory, except for, all this banned book stuff that it's a little frightening to see, but
yeah. But this is really good. I'm happy to speak with you to learn about even your community, because I wasn't even aware of a lot of the things going on in that area of Chicago. So that's very interesting to me. Now, what are you working on next? What other things are you working on?
I'm working on a story. This is a crazy story that while I was doing research for another D for Dee, I uncovered this little known fact that I didn't know, that there were 14,000 children, unaccompanied children, that were brought here from Cuba when Castro was taking over. And the United States flew all these children here, and they put them in foster homes, schools, adoptive families, relatives. And I had no idea that this refugee population, and they're called Pedro Pans. And so I put that on the back burner, and then I just started doing research about that. And I realized that was happening when I was like 10 years old. And so I decided that I knew a lot about that time period. And so that's the new book that I finished it, but my problem is I don't have an agent right now. So I'm struggling to find a place for it. But anyway, so it's historical fiction set in 1963, and it has a little girl who is a daughter of a NASA scientist who's very brilliant, but very socially awkward. And she moves next door to a Pedro Pan who has immigrated here, been a refugee here. But this little girl was living with her great uncle, who then went and was fighting in the Bay of Pigs. And when he came back, had to go into hiding. And so now she's living with the wrong family. So this little smarty pants girl, who hasn't really ever had a best friend, wants to make sure she saves her friend next door and doesn't let anything happen to her. And she mistakenly tries to be this white savior, and it does not go well for her. So that's what that story is about.
Well, that sounds really good too. So hopefully it'll find. So you didn't have an agent with your other book, or you just, because you connected with your editor.
I didn't.
Right.
I know. And that's, I mean, if you can get that gig, it's a great gig. I didn't even know how good it was, because I had a right of refusal in my contract. So it meant that my next book was automatically something they would publish unless they didn't like it.
Right.
So it was,
Yeah, that's
it was
nice.
nice.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, so now you're getting
So
an agent. Well, I'm sure that'll find a home. That sounds really timely too. So that's
yeah.
good.
So that's good.
But a key takeaway I'm getting from this too, talking with you, is as an author, you really have to do a lot of research. Of course, a lot of yours is historical, but even if it was contemporary, like with the diabetes, you do a lot of research to add that authenticity to the work.
I think the biggest difference between the contemporary books and the historical fiction is that the words that you use in contemporary, you don't have to research as much. I mean, of course, you have to, like you have to make sure you're up to kids speak of today, if they're not using a certain term.
Mm-hmm.
But when you write historical fiction, everything has to be the word cannot have come out later than the time period you're writing.
Oh.
So, and that's really tricky to figure out. And just little things like I had and even after it had gone through, I don't know how many edits, I thought it was done. And so we were going to celebrate and take a vacation. I was sitting at the airport in LA and I got an email from my editor and I opened it up and she was like, you need to take a look at these highlighted things I'm going through going, are you kidding me? Like babysitter. Babysitter was not a word in 1919.
Oh.
So I had to figure out another word.
Right.
Horse pucky. So I'm sitting at the airport trying to figure out another word for horse poop that I could use that came into being in 1919, and the worst one was I had said as the boat, this raft that the boys built gets into the lake, I said it had a mind of its own.
Oh.
Which just to me is, that's a word picture we would say. She said, I need you to justify that this was in existence in 1919.
Oh, okay.
And so I had to go through newspapers and, articles and dictionaries. And I finally found it in an advertisement for Vogue that said fashion had a mind of its own this year.
Oh,
so
good.
I could use it.
Yeah, so that's a lot. Yeah, I don't know if I want to write back, go back in the day and do, because I tried to write a historical adventure and it was so much more work. It was rejected when I tried to query that, but I said, I don't want to do that. But you have to be passionate about that topic and time period.
Yeah, and I'm not the best researcher. I mean, I'm not the most organized, but I have a couple of tips for if you're doing it. Well, one of them is the map and put things on the map. And the other one is to pull down a calendar from that time period so you know the days of the week and what day the dates fell on. And then onto that calendar, write the weather. So you can find weather patterns from, I don't know how, way far back. And you can write down, whether it was a sunny day or rainy day. So that can also be helpful when you're writing. And I create a spreadsheet with a list of all the events, like every day in that year and what happened on that day historically. And then there's a column on the other side for what happens in my book on that day.
Oh,
so that I can juxtapose those things. So for example, there was in the 1963 book that I'm working on right now, there was a water park that was closed to African American kids in Boston, I think it was. And that happened on a certain date, that the same day this little girl in the story is going on a slip and slide. So it was easy for me to go and have her read about that in the magazine and think about, I can go on this slip and slide, but those people that live in Boston, those kids can't. What does that mean? And to know like when Martin Luther King was marching and then what was happening in my book. So that's an easy way to kind of keep your events organized. And so when you're writing, it can jog your memory to say, I want to add that to the book. It'll fit in this area.
That is so neat. Yeah.
Okay. That's just a little tip I figured out.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, this makes I learned about some history in my area yesterday because I live in Houston. and it was about some of the slaves, because you know Juneteenth happened about 40 miles from where I live, or where they found out. Yeah, and I found out there's areas in my near where I live where there were plantations and all these different things, and there's markers there, like you're saying. And I just found out about one yesterday. I said I want to go back there, and listening to you's got me really excited.
You should write that. I don't think there's too many good books, right? I mean, I think there's one called White Lilies by Meyer, maybe, about Juneteenth, but there's not a lot.
Yeah.
So, one.
Yeah, it's good. Yeah. But
better get busy.
Yeah, get busy right here. But I want to thank you for joining us, Barbara. Thank you for all the guests for tuning in. This has been so enlightening and just inspiring. And we're learning about our history, because you're teaching me. I want to learn more about that, incident. Now, can you tell them about your book again? Tell them the name of it and where they can find it and find you.
It's called Crossing the Line. It's on Amazon.
Yes.
So, and it did win a Christopher Award, which was kind of exciting for me. Like authors, you don't think anything is going to ever happen good to you. You're like, oh God, I put this out there. I'm horrible with social media. So I'm like, but it won a Christopher Award, which is an award given for, to me, it was an important award because it's given to media that helps us rise, the human spirit rise, which is to me why I wrote that book, so that was an excitement for me. Although I didn't get to go to New York and get the award because the flight was canceled due to weather. So my editor had to accept it for me, but still.
Okay, well, congratulations. That's wonderful. That's wonderful.
Well, I'm so excited to meet you because I have given your book away to my students where I volunteer in Chicago. And now I can tell the kids that I met the author. So,
well, thank you so much, Barbara. I appreciate that. Now, what book was that? Do you know?
The first two of your series.
Okay.
Sophie.
Okay, Queen of the Being Snitched. Thank you.
Yep. Well, I love the snitch one.
Yeah, that's kids love that. Yes. Well, thank you, and thank you for all you do, and best wishes on your upcoming books, Barbara.
Oh, thank you. Thanks for having me. Same to you. I know you're querying some picture books, and I'm working on some of those too, but I find those much harder.
Right. We became acquainted in a picture book challenge. And I'm like, it's taken me, I'll sit there for hours agonizing over these 500 to 1,000 word manuscripts.
I know. Yeah,
so it's something, it's fun though. It's a challenge. It's something different. So I've been enjoying that. So, but it is difficult. Yeah. Well, thank you so much. Thank you everybody for joining us. And we'll see you next time for another episode of Write This. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Okay.